All right, so are you ready to dive into some pretty interesting legal stuff with us today?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Great. So today we're looking at Chapter 13 of the Bharatiya Nagarik Suraksha Sanhita
Okay.
2023, BNS 2023 for short.
Yeah.
And this chapter is called Of Contempts of the Lawful Authority of Public Servants. So this is all about respecting authority, but it gets into some really, really specific and maybe surprising details.
Yeah, it really does. It's not just like, big obvious things. It's like small everyday things that could get you in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump right into it. Let's say you get a summons to go to court. But you're super busy.
Oh, yeah. Happens all the time, right?
Right. So can you just ignore that? Like, what does this law say about that?
Well, if you look at sections 206 to 208,
Okay.
that's exactly what they deal with. It's about anything that blocks or stops those legal processes from happening, like ignoring a summons,
Right.
not showing up in court. All of that kind of falls under that umbrella.
So it's not like you're just going to get a, warning or something like that, right?
Right. It's a little bit more serious.
What kind of penalties are we talking?
So think of it like a scale. It depends.
Okay.
Like if you ignore a summons from like a local court, you might have to pay a small fine.
Okay.
But if you ignore like a high court order, like a subpoena,
Yeah.
you could end up in jail
Oh, wow.
or paying a really big fine.
So the message is pretty clear, right? Don't mess around with the courts.
Definitely. Like you have to cooperate with legal processes.
Yeah.
And the law is making it very clear that there are big consequences if you don't.
Okay. So let's take it a step further then. What about Section 209?
Okay. So Section 209, this is where it gets even more serious. Imagine you get this proclamation under the BNS 2023 and you completely ignore it.
So you're basically like off the grid,
Pretty much.
avoiding everything.
And if the court decides that you're a proclaimed offender, then those punishments get way worse. We're talking way longer jail time and way bigger fines.
So it's kind of like you're playing hide and seek, but with really high stakes.
Yeah, exactly. There are really serious consequences for avoiding those legal processes.
Wow. Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit. Sections 210 through 212 talk about honesty.
Right.
So like telling the truth, being accurate about the information you give to like officials and stuff.
Yeah. So these sections really emphasize how important it is to give public servants accurate information.
So no white lies, no little fibs, right? Like if you want to stay out of trouble.
Pretty much.
So is there a difference between like, holding back information and just like outright lying?
Yeah, so there's a clear distinction in the law.
Okay.
Section 211 deals with intentionally withholding information.
Okay.
And Section 212 is specifically about lying.
Got it.
And the punishments are different depending on what you do.
Okay, so let's make this real. Like what's an example of how these rules could play out?
Okay. So let's say you see a crime and you don't tell the police important details about what you saw. That could get you a month in jail, or you might have to pay a fine.
Okay.
But if you make up a whole story, especially if it messes up the investigation, you could be facing up to 2 years in prison.
Oh, wow.
So it's really important to be transparent and honest when you're talking to public servants.
Yeah, absolutely.
The law really emphasizes that.
That makes you think twice about exaggerating.
Right.
Or like even embellishing a little bit.
Yeah, even a little.
Yeah. Okay, so something that really stood out to me in these sections was that it says offense and offender can even include things you did outside of India. Like that's pretty big, right?
Yeah, it is. It means that they're taking a global approach to these offenses. So even if you did something wrong in another country, it could still have legal consequences in India.
So it's not like a, get out of jail free card if you come back to India. That's really interesting. Okay, so let's move on to sections 213 through 215. These sections talk about oaths, statements, and signatures when you're interacting with like government officials.
Yeah.
So like basically when you're in those official situations, anything you say or sign is really important and it has to be truthful.
Exactly. These sections emphasize how important honesty is in these situations.
One thing that I noticed was that the right to remain silent, like it doesn't actually say that here.
That's a good observation.
So like, does that mean that there might be a conflict with other parts of the law?
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the balance between individual rights and the government's interest in keeping things orderly and making sure the legal system works.
It's like a balancing act.
Yeah, exactly. Every democracy faces this challenge of finding that balance.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into the details. Section 216 is about perjury.
Right.
So, like, what does that mean?
So, perjury. Imagine you're in court, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then you lie.
Okay.
That's perjury.
Okay.
And it's considered a really serious offense because it messes with the whole idea of justice.
Yeah. And the penalties are pretty serious too, right?
Yeah, you could go to prison for up to 3 years.
Wow.
And you could also have to pay a big fine.
Okay. So honesty is definitely the best policy, especially in court.
Definitely.
Now, let's move on to Section 217. This one is about giving false information to a public servant.
Okay.
But there's a specific intention behind it.
Yeah, so in this case, it's not just about lying. It's about using that lie as a weapon.
Okay.
To manipulate them or to hurt someone else.
Got it. Can you give us an example? Like, how would that play out in real life?
Sure. So imagine someone makes up a story about a police officer doing something wrong. And because of that lie, the officer loses their job.
Wow.
Or let's say someone makes up a story about someone having illegal stuff.
Right.
So that the police will search their property and cause a lot of trouble. These are examples of how a simple lie can turn into something really harmful.
It's like a ripple effect, right?
Exactly.
Like one little lie can have these huge consequences.
And the law takes that very seriously.
Okay. Let's move on to sections 218 through 220. These sections are about what happens when public servants are trying to legally take or sell property, and someone tries to stop them.
Right. So these sections protect the authority of those public servants to do their job.
Okay.
When it comes to property.
Got it. So if someone tried to stop the police from taking property or they tried to disrupt an auction, that would be breaking these rules.
Exactly. It's against the law to obstruct those processes.
What kind of penalties are we talking about here?
So for resisting the seizure of property,
Yeah.
you could get up to 6 months in prison.
Oh, wow.
Or you might have to pay a fine of 10,000 rupees.
Okay, so pretty serious stuff.
Yeah. The law is making it very clear that interfering with official actions has real consequences.
Okay. So before we finish up part one, let's look at sections 221 through 223. These seem to cover a lot of different things.
Yeah, so these sections are about obstructing public servants while they're doing their jobs and the consequences of not following their lawful orders.
So it's not just about those specific things we talked about earlier, like ignoring a summons or lying in court.
Right. This is about respecting the authority of public servants in general.
Got it.
And following their instructions when they're doing their job.
Yeah. And the punishment for not following orders depends on how much harm is caused. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So if you don't follow an order and it leads to a dangerous situation like a riot, the punishment is going to be more severe.
So like the message is that not following orders can have these big unexpected consequences.
Right.
Not just for you, but for like the whole community.
Yeah, exactly. Your actions, even if you think they're small, can really affect public safety.
Yeah. Okay. So that wraps up part one of our deep dive into contempts of the lawful authority of public servants.
It's really interesting, right? Like how they're trying to balance those things.
Yeah, it's a fine line for sure. And it feels like we're about to get into some even trickier stuff here.
Yeah.
Sections 224 through 226.
Right.
These are about threats and even like attempted suicide as a way to manipulate public servants.
It's kind of scary, right? Like how far people might go to try and control or influence people in those positions. It's really about recognizing that and making sure that those who are serving the public are protected.
Absolutely. So Section 224, this is specifically about threats against a public servant or someone they care about to try and make them do something or to stop them from doing their job.
Right. Like imagine someone threatening a judge to try and influence how they decide a case.
Wow.
Or intimidating a police officer who's investigating a crime.
Yeah.
It's about making it very clear that those kinds of threats are not okay.
Right. And the penalties are pretty serious, right?
Yeah. Up to 2 years in prison and a fine.
So they're not messing around with this.
No, not at all.
It's like saying, we're not going to let people intimidate those who are supposed to uphold the law?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. What about Section 225?
So this one deals with a slightly different situation, but it's related.
Okay.
It's about threatening someone to stop them from asking a public servant for help.
So like if someone sees a crime or if they're being harassed
Right.
and they want to report it to the police. This section is saying it's illegal to threaten them to stop them from doing that.
Exactly. It's about making sure that people feel safe
Yeah.
to go to the authorities for protection.
Without being afraid.
Right. It's about making it easier for people to get justice.
Yeah.
And removing anything that might stop them from doing that.
Absolutely. So that brings us to section 226.
This one's a tough one. It's about attempting suicide as a way to manipulate a public servant.
Wow, this is a really heavy topic.
Yeah, it is.
So the law is recognizing that people who are really struggling might do something extreme, but it's also trying to stop people from using that to manipulate someone in a position of authority.
Yeah, like if someone threatens to hurt themselves,
Right.
to try and force a public servant to make a certain decision. That's what this section is about.
And the consequences are pretty significant, right?
Yeah, up to a year in prison, a fine, and even community service.
It's like they're saying this is really serious.
It is.
You can't just use someone's empathy or their sense of duty to get what you want.
Exactly.
It's about protecting those public servants because at the end of the day, they're human beings too.
They are.
And they have to make decisions based on facts and the law.
Right.
Not because someone is pressuring them or trying to manipulate their emotions.
It's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And this section is about making sure they can do their jobs without that extra burden.
So it's interesting, right? Like looking at this whole chapter,
Yeah,
it covers a lot of different situations.
it does.
From those minor things to really serious and even disturbing scenarios.
And it all comes back to protecting those public servants.
Yeah.
And making sure they can do their jobs well and without being afraid. It's about making sure the society can function properly and fairly.
But it also seems like it's about finding that balance between respecting authority and protecting individual rights.
Right. That's the key.
And that's something that's always evolving and changing, right?
Absolutely. It's an ongoing conversation in any society that values both freedom and the rule of law.
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up completely,
Yeah.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the bigger picture here.
Okay.
What does all of this tell us about how India views the relationship between citizens and the state today?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, it really makes you think, right?
It does.
So what do you think?
Well, it seems like these laws show how much India wants to keep things orderly and make sure that their government institutions can work smoothly.
Right.
They want to give those public servants the power they need to do their job without people getting in the way.
Yeah.
And they're holding people accountable for doing things that could weaken the government's authority.
So it's like they're saying, hey, we value the people who work for the government and we expect everyone to respect them.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But I also wonder where we draw the line. Like, how much power should these public servants actually have?
Right.
And when does, like, voicing your concerns or disagreements turn into something that's actually breaking the law?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
It is.
I'm sure it's something that people are always discussing and debating.
Oh, definitely. Any democracy has to figure out how to respect authority while still protecting individual freedoms.
So it's not just about blindly following the rules, right?
No, not at
But
all.
you can question things. You can challenge those in authority.
Yeah, within reason, of course.
Right.
It's about finding ways to engage with the government respectfully,
Yeah.
to hold them accountable, and to speak up for change when you think it's needed.
I think that brings up a good point that you made earlier about how laws are always evolving and changing.
Oh, absolutely.
Like what we're seeing in the BNS 2023, this is just how India is approaching these issues right now.
Exactly. It's just a snapshot in time. What might have been considered okay in the past might not be okay today. And things will probably keep changing as society's values shift.
So it's like a living document.
Yeah, I like that.
It's reflecting this relationship between the people and the government and how it changes over time.
And that's why it's so important for people to stay informed,
Right.
to get involved and to help shape these laws.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive on contempts of the lawful authority of public servants, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Well, I think the most important thing is awareness.
Okay.
To understand that there are rules and principles that guide how we interact with those public servants.
Yeah.
And to recognize that our actions matter.
Right.
They can have good or bad consequences.
So it's not just about knowing the law, it's about being a responsible citizen.
Absolutely. It's about interacting with authority in a respectful and constructive way, while also understanding your own rights and the limits of their power.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
It is.
Between order and freedom, respect, and dissent.
You said it perfectly.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and with our listener.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this part of Indian law. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you.